The warding sigils carved into the lead-lined ribs of the Lebanon bunker did not burn out or shatter, but simply ceased to have meaning, dissolving into meaningless scratches against a reality that had suddenly forgotten the rules of magic. Castiel was the first to fall, his vessel seizing as a sound unlike any angelic frequency shrieked through the multi-dimensional wavelength of his grace, a discordant and jagged tearing of the narrative fabric itself that tasted like rusted iron and cheap newsprint. It was the sound of a universe vomiting. In the main war room, Dean Winchester racked the slide of his custom 1911, not out of tactical necessity, but out of muscle memory, his eyes unable to track the entity that had unfolded out of a hole in the air that smelled of stale chimichangas and rotting ozone. This was not a demon smoke entry or an angelic descent, but a tumorous rupture in the side of existence that defied the neatly ordered cosmology of heaven and hell. The intruder lay in a heap on the map table, a garish red and black smear against the muted earth tones of the bunker, groaning in a voice that sounded like gravel in a blender. Blood pooled beneath the figure, but the blood was wrong because it bubbled and hissed, knitting itself back together with a wet and sickening biological urgency that defied the laws of entropy. Sam Winchester stood frozen near the library entrance, his hand hovering over the demon blade, his mind reeling because the creature was speaking. But the words were visible to the naked eye as floating yellow captions hanging in the air like toxic gas, burning the retinas of anyone who looked directly at them. The intruder was narrating his own pain, breaking the silence of the bunker with a stream of consciousness that referenced gods Sam had never read about in any lore book, speaking to an audience that was not there. Castiel writhed on the floor, clutching his ears, bleeding silver grace from his nose because he could hear the voices inside the red man's head. And they were not the voices of souls or demons, but the cacophony of 1 billion distinct observers staring into the bunker from a dimension above God himself. The angel screamed that the script was bleeding, that the walls of the cage were not broken but ignored, rendered obsolete by a chaotic variable that refused to acknowledge the authority of the author. The red figure sat up, his neck snapping back into place with a bone-grinding crunch that echoed through the silent command center, and looked directly at a point in space 3 feet to the left of Dean's head, addressing the empty air with a manic familiarity that made the skin crawl on the hunter's arms. When Dean fired, the bullet struck the figure's mask, flattening against the skull before falling uselessly to the table, pushed out by regenerating tissue that moved faster than the eye could follow. The intruder did not fall. He did not die. He did not follow the physics of the supernatural universe, where death is a currency and a consequence. Instead, he laughed, a wet and bubbling sound that felt like a mockery of the very concept of mortality, and asked if they had the budget for a guest star of his caliber. Across the globe, the reaction was instantaneous and violent. In the empty throne room of heaven, the angels watching the great machine of fate saw the loom of destiny ignite and burn to ash. In the cage, Michael and Lucifer stopped their eternal war, united for a single heartbeat by a sudden, terrifying confusion, as the walls of their prison vibrated with a frequency that originated from a comic book dimension composed of ink and cynicism. Chuck, writing in a bar in New Orleans, felt his pen snap in his hand, ink splattering across his manuscript like black blood, because for the first time since the dawn of creation, a character had entered his story that he did not create, did not control, and could not erase. The ink on the page began to move on its own, forming speech bubbles that mocked the creator, drawing a crude katana through the text of the apocalypse. The disruption was not just physical, but theological. The intruder was a cancer in the story of the world, a metastatic cell from a different organism entirely, and the immune system of the supernatural reality began to mobilize with terrifying lethality. Thunder rumbled over Kansas, not from a storm front, but from the grinding gears of a reality trying to reject a foreign object that was rapidly, gleefully metastasizing into the plot. The bunker shook as the ley lines beneath it convulsed, twisting under the weight of a paradox that wore a mask and carried pouches filled with impossible weaponry. Dean looked at Sam, and in that shared glance, they understood that the law was useless. The cult would fail, and the ritual was irrelevant. They were no longer fighting a monster. They were fighting a genre shift. The bullet casing spun on the polished concrete floor of the bunker, the brass chiming a solitary note that seemed to hang in the air far longer than physics should allow. Dean Winchester stood with his chest heaving, the smell of cordite sharp in his nose, watching the impossible creature rise from the table. The man in the red suit did not move like a leviathan or a shifter. He moved with a jerky, erratic fluidity, snapping his jaw back into place with a wet pop that made Sam wince. The intruder rubbed the spot on his mask where the bullet had flattened his skull, tilting his head as if listening to a frequency that bypassed the ears entirely and vibrated directly into the brainstem. To Castiel, who was currently curled on the floor with his hands pressed against his temples, the intruder was a blinding void in the tapestry of creation. Angels perceive the soul as a light, a specific wavelength of divine intent. But this creature had a soul that looked like a shattered mirror, thousands of jagged shards reflecting a chaotic, nonsensical morality that shifted with every passing second. The angel could hear the voices surrounding the red man, a chorus of millions of invisible observers screaming for violence, for jokes, for blood, for narrative progression. It was the sound of a universe where consequence was the punchline. Castiel tried to stand, his grace flaring in a defensive posture, but the very air around the intruder felt greasy and unstable, resisting the imposition of angelic will. The intruder hopped off the table, his boots making a squelching sound, and drew two handguns that looked like toys but smelled of high-grade military propellant. He pointed one at Dean and one at Sam, but his head was turned toward the empty corner of the room. He spoke, and the words felt heavy, dragging on the listeners' minds like lead weights. He complained about the lighting, calling it moody and underfunded, and asked where the craft services table was located. Dean did not hesitate. He signaled Sam with a sharp tilt of his head, a move practiced over decades of hunting things that refused to die. Sam lunged to the left, drawing the demon-killing knife, while Dean laid down suppressive fire, aiming for the joints, the knees, and elbows, trying to dismantle the mechanics of the body, since the brain seemed irrelevant. The bullets tore through the red suit, shredding Kevlar and flesh, spraying the map table with blood that smelled chemically distinct, like battery acid and stale tacos. The intruder laughed, a gargling sound as a lung perforated and instantly healed. He did not fire back. Instead, he pirouetted through the hail of lead, moving with a dancer's grace that contradicted his tactical gear. He kicked the gun out of Dean's hand with a force that cracked the hunter's wrist, then caught Sam's arm mid-swing. The demon blade, forged to kill the entities of hell, bit into the intruder's forearm and stopped. It did not burn him. It did not sizzle or spark. It simply acted as a sharp piece of metal cutting meat. The magic in the blade found no purchase because the creature was not of hell, heaven, or purgatory. He was terrestrial but alien, a biological impossibility. The intruder twisted Sam's arm, not breaking it but forcing him to drop the knife, and then head-butted the younger Winchester. Sam stumbled back, seeing stars and floating yellow boxes that questioned his hair care routine. Castiel saw the opening. He stepped forward, his eyes glowing with the terrifying blue-white light of celestial power. He raised a hand, intent on smiting the creature, burning it out of existence with a touch of pure grace. He placed his palm on the intruder's chest. The bunker lit up with blinding radiance. The sound of thunder cracked inside the room, shattering the glass of the lamps and shaking dust from the ventilation ducts. But when the light faded, the intruder was still standing. He looked down at the smoking handprint on his chest, then up at the angel. He asked if that was supposed to be a special effect, or if the angel was just happy to see him. Castiel stumbled back, horror dawning on his face. The smite had worked. He had felt the tissue burn, felt the heart stop, felt the atoms scatter. But the creature had simply decided not to die. The narrative force keeping him alive was stronger than the angelic command to end. The intruder slapped Castiel on the shoulder, staining the trench coat with the blood, and declared that he was bored with the exposition. He reached into a pouch that looked too small to hold anything significant and pulled out a grenade. It was not a standard fragmentation grenade. It was painted with a crude smiley face. He pulled the pin and dropped it on the floor. Dean screamed for Sam and CAs to get down. The explosion was not fiery but concussive. A blast of force had knocked the Winchesters into the library shelves and sent books flying like startled birds. When the dust settled, the intruder was gone. The heavy steel door of the bunker, locked and warded against gods and monsters, was standing wide open. The intricate sigil scorched off the metal. Dean coughed, waving away the smoke, and pulled himself up using an overturned chair. His wrist throbbed, but the adrenaline masked the pain. He looked at Sam, who was wiping blood from his nose. They had faced Lucifer, the darkness, and the British men of letters, but they had never been so thoroughly dismantled in under 2 minutes by something that treated combat like a sketch comedy. Castiel stood in the center of the room, staring at the open door. The angel looked sick. He told the brothers that the creature was not just a monster. He was a hole in the world. He was a being whose existence relied on the observation of others, a tulpa of infinite power fueled by a dimension of watchers who craved chaos. Dean reloaded his gun, his face hardening into the mask of the soldier. He didn't care about the metaphysics. He cared that something dangerous was loose in Lebanon, Kansas. He grabbed his keys. The Impala roared to life in the garage, the sound usually comforting. But today, it felt small against the silence of the disruption. As they drove out of the bunker, the sky above Kansas was the wrong color. It was a bruised purple, streaked with veins of neon green that pulsed in time with a heartbeat that wasn't there. The local reality was reacting to the infection. In the back seat, Castiel tuned the angel radio, but all he heard was static and the faint, tinny sound of a chimichanga commercial playing on a loop. The intruder had not just escaped, he was broadcasting. 10 miles away, in a roadside diner that served coffee that tasted like burnt tires, Deadpool sat in a booth, drawing on a placemat with a crayon he had found in his pocket. The waitress, a woman named Erlene, who had seen everything from shapeshifters to angels in her 40 years of service, stood frozen behind the counter. She wanted to scream, but her voice was trapped in her throat. The man in the red suit had eaten 6 stacks of pancakes, pushing them through the bottom of his mask without taking it off, a physical impossibility that made her eyes water. He was talking to the ketchup bottle, explaining his backstory, referencing events and people that did not exist in this universe. He spoke of mutants, of a man with metal claws, of a cable guy from the future. The reality around him seemed to bend to accommodate his delusions. The ketchup bottle rattled as if trying to answer. A fly buzzed near his head, then suddenly turned into a miniature biplane and crashed into his coffee cup. Erlene rubbed her eyes, praying this was a stroke. It wasn't. It was the leakage. Deadpool finished his drawing, a crude depiction of him riding a chimera while Dean Winchester cried in the corner, and slapped a gold coin on the table. The coin was not legal tender. It was a doubloon from a pirate treasure that shouldn't exist. He slid out of the booth, stretching his arms, and announced that it was time to find the writer's room. He had decided that this universe was too grim, too desaturated. It needed a rewrite. He kicked the door open, shattering the glass, and walked out into the parking lot. A trucker, agitated by the noise, stepped out of his rig and shouted at the red figure. Deadpool didn't turn around. He simply pointed a finger over his shoulder, and the truck's tires simultaneously exploded, not from a gunshot, but because the scene required a punctuation mark. The trucker fell silent. Deadpool walked down the center of the highway, humming a pop song that hadn't been written yet in this timeline. He was looking for a sign, and he found it in the form of a billboard advertising a lawyer who promised to get you what you deserved. Deadpool decided he deserved a montage. Back at the bunker, Sam was frantically tearing through the law books. He had piles of ancient scrolls, tablets, and leather-bound tomes scattered across the library table. He was looking for anything on the fourth wall. The concept existed in literary theory, in the obscure metaphysical ramblings of mad poets, but never as a biological reality. Dean paced the room, icing his wrist. He wanted to hunt, to track, to kill. Research felt like stalling, but Sam insisted. They needed to know the rules before they played the game. Sam found a reference in a dusty tome penned by a mad monk in the 14th century, a man who had claimed to see the strings of the puppets. The monk described entities called the narrators, beings of pure chaos who could rewrite the laws of physics to suit their amusement. The text warned that interacting with such a being was infectious. The more you engaged with them, the more your own reality became a story, subject to tropes and cliches rather than cause and effect. Sam felt a chill. They were already in a story, Chuck's story, but this was different. Chuck liked structure, arcs, tragedy. This new thing was anti-structure. It was entropy wearing spandex. Castiel returned from a scouting flight. He had tried to ascend to heaven to consult the collective consciousness of the seraphim, but the gates were barred. Not locked, but barred from the inside. The angels were terrified. They had seen the loom of fate tangle. A single thread had turned red and was weaving itself through the tapestry, cutting other threads, tying knots where there should be straight lines. The angels were in lockdown, afraid that if they intervened, they would be written out of existence. Retconned. Castiel used the word with a heaviness that terrified Dean. Retconned. To be erased so completely that you never existed at all. That was the weapon the intruder carried. Not guns, but the power of the retcon. Dean slammed his fist on the table. He didn't care about retcons. He cared about leverage. Everyone had a weakness. If this guy was a character, he had a tragic flaw. They just needed to find it. Meanwhile, in the throne room of hell, Crowley swirled a glass of Craig in his hand, staring at a monitor that showed a heat map of supernatural activity. Usually, the map was a steady constellation of demonic deals, monster attacks, and hauntings. Today, there was a black hole moving through Kansas, a void where no deals could be made. Crowley had sent a crossroads demon, a sharp-suited closer named Gerald, to intercept the entity and assess its value. Gerald had not returned. Instead, Crowley's desk had manifested a package, a box wrapped in human skin. Not flayed skin, but comic book paneling printed on skin. Inside was Gerald's head, but the head was still alive, singing show tunes. Attached to the ear was a note. "Keep the change, you filthy animal." Crowley felt a headache building behind his eyes. This was not the work of a hunter or a rogue angel. This was unprofessionalism weaponized. Crowley knew about the multiverse. He knew there were other realities, but they were supposed to be sealed, kept separate by the cosmic membrane. Someone had punctured the membrane, or more likely, someone had been thrown through it. Crowley stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. If heaven was locking its doors, hell had an opportunity. Chaos was bad for business, but managed chaos? That was a ladder. He teleported, intending to appear behind the Winchesters in the bunker to offer a temporary alliance. But when he snapped his fingers, nothing happened. He stood in his throne room, looking at his hand. He snapped again. A puff of smoke, pink and smelling of bubble gum, wheezed out of his thumb. Crowley's eyes widened. The magic wasn't gone, was being rewritten. The rules of teleportation had been changed to funny. He was trapped in hell until the narrative decided it was amusing for him to leave. Rage, cold and sharp, took hold of the king of hell. He screamed for his minions to find a way out, to dig if they had to. The foundations of his kingdom were turning into a joke, and Crowley did not do comedy. Deadpool hitched a ride on the back of a pickup truck heading towards Sioux Falls. He didn't know why he was going there, only that the plot required him to meet a gruff father figure, and his genre-savvy instincts told him that a man named Bobby Singer used to live there. He knew Bobby was dead, but death was a revolving door in this place. He checked his pouches. He was running low on ammo, but his regeneration was working overtime. The air in this universe was heavy, laden with angst and repressed emotion. It tasted like whiskey and regret. He hated it. He missed the bright colors of New York. He missed the tacos. But most of all, he missed the logic of his own insanity. Here, the insanity was external. Monsters were real, but they were boring. They had rules. Silver for shifters, salt for ghosts. It was too procedural. He wanted to break the procedural. He pulled out a Sharpie and began to write on the side of the pickup truck. He wrote "The road so far" in big block letters. Then he drew a picture of himself decapitating a werewolf. The ink sank into the metal, glowing faintly. He was marking his territory. As the truck rumbled down the highway, the reality behind it began to fray. Trees along the road turned into 2D cutouts. The sky flickered like a bad fluorescent bulb. The driver, oblivious, kept listening to classic rock. Deadpool tapped the roof of the cab. The driver looked in the rearview mirror and saw not a man in a red suit, but a nightmare. A rotting corpse telling him to turn left at the next dimension. The driver swerved, crashing through a guardrail and tumbling down an embankment. Deadpool leapt off mid-tumble, landing in a superhero pose on the asphalt. The truck exploded in a massive fireball behind him. He didn't look. He just sighed. "Minimal effort," he muttered to the empty road. "I give it a 3 out of 10. He started walking again. He needed a weapon that fit the tone. Something jagged. Something that hurt just to look at. He sensed a scrapyard nearby. In the bunker, the alarm system began to wail. Not the proximity alarm, but the seismic sensor. The epicenter was moving. It was heading north. Dean grabbed his duffel bag. Sam grabbed the law books. Castiel grabbed his angel blade, though he looked at it with doubt. They piled into the Impala. Dean revved the engine, the familiar vibration grounding him. They were the guys who saved the world. They stopped the apocalypse. They killed Hitler. They could handle a clown in a red suit. But as they sped out of the garage, the radio turned on by itself. It wasn't playing rock. It was playing a warped, slowed-down version of Carry On Wayward Son, sung by a voice that sounded like gargling gravel. The voice broke through the music. Testing, testing. Is this thing on? Hello, fanboys. Welcome to the crossover event nobody asked for, but everybody is paying for. Buckle up. The fourth wall is down, and I'm coming for your plot armor. Dean smashed the radio with the butt of his gun. Silence filled the car, heavy and suffocating. Sam looked out the window. The cornfields were bleeding. Red sap oozed from the stalks. The scarecrows were turning their heads to watch the car pass. The world was listening to the new narrator. The disruption had caught the attention of forces far older than the Winchesters. In the empty, the cosmic void where angels and demons go after death, the shadow stirred. It had felt the arrival of the intruder. The shadow was the ultimate nihilist, the being that craved silence and sleep. Deadpool was noise. He was eternal, screaming, vibrant noise. The shadow hated him instantly. It began to seep out of the empty, defying the laws that bound it, reaching a tendril of pure darkness towards Earth. It wanted to silence the red man. It wanted to sleep. But as the darkness touched the edge of the intruder's influence, it recoiled. The darkness burned, not from light, but from absurdity. The shadow realized with a cosmic horror that it could not consume Deadpool. If it absorbed him, he would not sleep. He would talk inside the shadow forever. He would narrate the void. The shadow retreated, sealing the cracks behind it. It would not intervene. It would hide. This was the first time the shadow had known fear. Deadpool found the scrapyard. It was a graveyard of rusted metal and forgotten dreams. Perfect. He rummaged through the piles of junk until he found a rusted machete and a coil of barbed wire. He wrapped the wire around the blade, humming a tune. He needed to upgrade. He needed to level up. He saw a shape moving in the shadows of the crushed cars. Vampires, a nest of them, using the junkyard as a hideout. They were fast, strong, and hungry. They smelled the fresh blood on him. They encircled him, hissing, baring their fangs. The leader, a burly vampire with a leather jacket, stepped forward. "You're a long way from home, freak," he sneered. Deadpool looked at them. He tilted his head. Vampires, really, in this economy. The vampires lunged. Deadpool didn't dodge. He let the first one bite his neck. The vampire clamped down, drinking deep, and then immediately pulled back, retching. Deadpool's blood was cancerous, toxic, a sludge of weaponized mutation. The vampire vomited black bile, his skin blistering. Deadpool laughed. "Spicy, right? That's the chimichanga kicker." He swung the barbed wire machete. The fight was brutal, short and gory. But as Deadpool dismantled the nest, something strange happened. When he beheaded a vampire, the head didn't just roll away. It exploded into confetti. When he staked one, a sound effect bubble reading "thwack" appeared in midair, solid enough that the vampire slumped against it. The reality of the supernatural universe was trying to process Deadpool's violence and failing, defaulting to his rules. The remaining vampires fled, terrified not of death, but of the wrongness of it. Deadpool stood amidst the carnage, the confetti settling on his shoulders like snow. He looked at the camera that wasn't there. He whispered, "Now, let's go find the moose and the squirrel." Sam and Dean found the junkyard an hour later. The police were already there, but they were standing by their cars, refusing to enter. The Winchesters flashed their fake badges and ducked under the tape, What they saw stopped them cold. The bodies of the vampires were arranged in a pyramid. At the top of the pyramid was a sign written in vampire blood. Be right back. Went to get tacos. But it wasn't the bodies that disturbed Sam. It was the air. The air shimmered with a faint, iridescent haze. Sam reached out and touched the air. His finger met resistance. He pushed harder. The air rippled like water. He looked at Dean, his face pale. "Dean," he said, his voice trembling. "The fabric of reality here. It's thin, like worn-out paper." Dean looked at the pyramid, then at the ripple. "So?" Dean asked. "So," Sam said, "if he keeps doing this, if he keeps forcing his physics onto our world, he's going to tear the page." Dean stared at the sign. "Tear the page?" Sam nodded. "He's not just killing monsters, Dean. He's unmaking the world. We don't just have to kill him. We have to cancel him." Dean racked his slide. "Then let's go find the remote." They walked back to the car, the iridescent haze spreading behind them, slowly eating the junkyard, turning the rusted metal into grey static. The breach had begun. The infection was spreading, and somewhere in the distance, a laugh echoed, loud and devoid of all sanity. Deep in the bunker, a book fell off the shelf in the archives. It was the Book of the Damned. It fell open to a page that had always been blank. Now, ink was bleeding onto the parchment, forming words in a language that predated humanity, predated angels. It was the language of the editors. The ink formed a warning. The variant must be purged. The book began to heat up, scorching the wooden table. The warning was not a suggestion. It was a command from the immune system of the multiverse. A command that would summon something far worse than a demon or an angel. Something designed to wipe the slate clean. The story was about to escalate, and the first casualty would be the concept of mercy. The Winchesters drove into the night, chasing a red comet that was burning their world down, unaware that the road ahead didn't just lead to a confrontation. It led to a blank page, the sound of a page turning, loud and crisp in the silence of the Kansas night. The darkness swallowed the Impala's taillights, and for a moment, the world felt very, very fragile. The Impala tore down the interstate, the speedometer needle vibrating past 100, but the distance to the horizon never seemed to close. The geography of Kansas had become non-Euclidean. Miles stretched and compressed, like an accordion played by a lunatic. Sam sat in the passenger seat, his laptop open, watching the screen flicker with impossible data. The internet was dissolving. News sites were being replaced by splash pages of vibrant, nonsensical colors, and the stock market ticker was scrolling insults instead of numbers. The infection wasn't just physical, it was informational. The entity known as Deadpool was rewriting the metadata of their reality. Dean gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his eyes scanning the road for threats that made sense, but nothing did. A deer darted across the highway, but as the headlights caught it, the animal didn't freeze or run. It pixelated, dissolving into a shower of green cubes before reassembling as a lawn flamingo. Dean didn't swerve. He didn't blink. He just drove harder, the engine of the Chevy roaring a defiant protest against a world losing its mind. In the back seat, Castiel was silent, his head bowed. He was listening to the screams of the garrison. The angels weren't under attack by demons. They were being unwritten. One by one, their names were fading from the celestial register, replaced by crude doodles. Castiel could feel the panic radiating from heaven, a cold, sterile terror that he had never felt from his brothers and sisters before. They were soldiers of God, prepared for war, for apocalypse, for oblivion. They were not prepared for satire. The destination was a crossroads in the middle of nowhere, a dirt intersection marked on no map, but burned into the subconscious of every desperate soul who had ever wanted to make a deal. The Winchesters knew the spot. It was where the veil between earth and hell was thin, a scar tissue on the skin of the world. But as they approached, the sky above the crossroads wasn't the usual star-dusted black. It was a swirling vortex of primary colors, a bruising storm of red and yellow that looked like a comic panel blown up to the size of a hurricane. Lightning didn't strike, it scribbled. Jagged, drawn lines of electricity arced down, hitting the ground with sounds that were phonetically spelled out in the air. Krakum. Zzz-it. Poit. Dean slammed the brakes, the Impala skidding to a halt on gravel that felt too uniform, too perfectly rendered. They spilled out of the car, weapons drawn. Sam held a demon knife. Dean held a sawed-off shotgun, loaded with shells packed with salt, iron, and witch-killing ash. Castiel drew his angel blade. In the center of the crossroads, illuminated by the spotlight of the unnatural storm, stood Deadpool. He had set up a folding table and 2 chairs. He was wearing a party hat. Opposite him sat a crossroads demon, a mid-level bureaucrat named Barthamus, who usually projected an aura of oily confidence. Now, Barthamus looked like he was having a nervous breakdown. He was clutching a contract that was smoking. The parchment trying to curl away from the pen Deadpool was forcing into his hand. Deadpool was speaking, his voice amplified by the acoustics of the storm. He was negotiating, but he wasn't asking for talent or wealth or life. He was asking for a retcon. He wanted the demon to canonize a backstory that involved him being the secret loved child of God and a chimichanga. Barthamus was trembling, his red eyes darting around, looking for an exit, but the invisible walls of the narrative held him in the chair. The demon's powers, teleportation, telekinesis, reality warping, were null and void in the face of a superior reality warper. Deadpool poked the demon in the chest. He explained that he had a coupon. He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pouch. It was a jagged scrap of a comic book page. He slapped it on the table. The table groaned. The reality around them began to buckle. The sheer weight of an object from a different cosmology pressing against the laws of the supernatural universe was causing a gravitational shear. Sam shouted, stepping into the light. He ordered the demon to flee. It was a rare moment, a Winchester saving a demon. But Sam understood the physics of what was happening. If that deal was signed, if the ink of hell mixed with the ink of the intruder, the contract would create a binding paradox. Barthamus tried to stand, but Deadpool kicked his shin under the table. The sound of the bone breaking was a comedic trumpet blast. The demon screamed. Dean didn't wait. He fired. The salt blast hit Deadpool in the chest, shredding the red suit. Deadpool looked down, unimpressed. He reached into the wound and pulled out a handful of salt, sprinkling it over his shoulder like he was cooking. He told Dean he was under-seasoned. Then the escalation began. Castiel moved. He didn't try to smite. He tried to banish. He began the incantation in Invoking, the tongue of angels, words that were the source code of creation. He spoke the syllables that commanded a soul to depart the earthly plane. The air vibrated. The storm swirled faster. Deadpool looked at Castiel, and for a second, the white lenses of his mask narrowed. He didn't like the sound of the language. It was too serious. It reminded him of editorial mandates. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the remote control. It was a standard TV remote, held together with duct tape. He pointed it at Castiel and pressed the mute button. Castiel's mouth kept moving, but no sound came out. The angel grabbed his throat, panic flaring in his eyes. The Enochian magic died in his windpipe. Deadpool laughed, a sound that grated on the soul and turned back to the demon. He grabbed Barthelmeus's hand and forced the pen onto the paper. The demon shrieked as the nib touched the parchment. It wasn't ink that flowed. It was a black, corrosive sludge that ate through the table, ate through the ground, and began to drip into the metaphysical foundations of the world. The ground beneath the crossroads cracked, not a fissure, but a shatter like glass. Spiderwebs of white nothingness spread out from the table. The no-death condition was triggering. In the supernatural universe, death is a mechanic. It is a rigid, bureaucratic system overseen by reapers and ultimately by death personified. Souls leave the body, enter the veil, and are sorted. It is the absolute law. But Deadpool acts as a virus that defies this law. By forcing a demon to sign a contract that acknowledged his nonsensical backstory, he introduced a logic error into the system. The contract burned, turning into a pillar of green fire that punched a hole in the sky. The shockwave knocked the Winchesters off their feet. The demon, Barthelmeus, dissolved, not into smoke, but into a pile of untextured grey polygons. He had been deleted. And then the silence fell. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. The storm vanished. The sky returned to a dull, bruised purple. Dean stood up, coughing. He looked at Sam. Sam was staring at his hand. He had cut it on a rock when he fell. The blood was dripping, but it wasn't hitting the ground. The droplets were hovering in mid-air, suspended in a localized time dilation. Dean looked at the crossroads. Deadpool was gone. The table was gone. In their place was a hole. A jagged, pixelated tear in the fabric of the world that led nowhere. It was a glitched texture. The catastrophe was not immediately explosive. It was insidious. It started in the hospitals. 10 minutes after the contract was signed, a heart monitor in a squalid ER in Detroit flatlined. The doctors rushed in, paddles charged, adrenaline ready. They shocked the patient. Nothing. The heart had stopped. The brain activity was zero. Clinically, the man was dead. But then, the man sat up. He didn't gasp, he didn't breathe. He simply sat up, looked at the doctors with dead, milky eyes, and asked for a glass of water. He was a corpse that refused to be a corpse. This scene repeated in London, in Tokyo, in Buenos Aires. The mechanism of death had jammed. The reapers, the invisible workers who ferried souls, found themselves unable to touch the dead. Their hands passed through the souls like smoke. The queue for the afterlife had been deleted. The souls were trapped in their rotting bodies, tethered to a mortal coil that could no longer sustain them but refused to release them. Billy, the new death, the entity who had replaced the ancient horseman, stood in her library in the warding. The thousands of books that recorded the deaths of every living thing were reacting violently. The books were screaming. Leather bindings tore open as pages flew out, swirling in a chaotic whirlwind. Billy watched with a cold, terrifying detachment as the ink on the pages began to run, pooling on the floor. She reached for her scythe, the weapon that could kill anything, even God. The handle felt cold, colder than usual. It felt brittle. She looked at the blade. It was rusting at a rate of centuries per second. The corruption of the intruder had reached the conceptual level. If death could not function, the universe would become a cancer, growing uncontrollably, rotting but never ending. Billy realized she could not stay in her realm. She had to intervene. She had to step onto the board. She dissolved into shadow, heading for the source of the rot. Back in Kansas, the Winchesters were driving, but the car felt wrong. The engine didn't hum. It synthesized. Sam was on the phone, calling every hunter in the network. The reports were identical and horrifying. Monsters weren't dying. A hunter in Nebraska had decapitated a ghoul, but the head kept biting, and the body kept thrashing, blindly searching for its missing piece. A pack of werewolves in Oregon had been shot full of silver, but they just lay there, burning and screaming, unable to die. The release of death was gone. The suffering was infinite. Dean slammed his hand on the steering wheel. This was worse than the darkness, worse than the apocalypse. This was a torture chamber the size of a planet. "We have to find him," Dean growled. "We have to put him in a box that he can't joke his way out of." Castiel, his voice finally returning after the mute effect wore off, spoke from the back. "We cannot trap him, Dean. The box of Malik, the cage. They operate on laws of physics and magic. He ignores them. We need a weapon that operates on his logic." Sam turned. "What does that mean?" "A cartoon anvil." Castiel didn't smile. "We need a plot hole. We need to trick him into a narrative dead end." They tracked him to a shopping mall in Lawrence. Of course it was a mall. It was the quintessential setting for a zombie movie, and Deadpool was leaning into the trope. The mall was abandoned, the lights flickering, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the undying. Civilians who had died in car crashes, heart attacks, or violent crimes in the last hour, who were now wandering the food court, confused, broken, holding their own severed limbs or clutching chest wounds that wouldn't close. They weren't zombies. They were victims of a broken reality. They were crying, asking for help, asking why they couldn't sleep. Deadpool was in the center atrium, riding the mechanical bull. He had wired the bull to the mall's main power grid, and it was spinning at a blurred speed. He was shouting, "Yee-haw!" and firing his pistols into the glass ceiling, shattering the skylights. The broken glass rained down on the suffering immortals below, cutting them, but they didn't bleed. They just leaked grey static. Dean, Sam, and Castiel entered the atrium. The smell hit them first, not rot, but ozone and burnt plastic. The smell of a scorched server room. Billy appeared beside them. She didn't announce herself. The air simply grew cold, and she was there. She looked tired. Her leather coat was frayed. Her scythe was pitted with rust. She looked at Deadpool, and for the first time in the history of the universe, Death looked disgusted. "He is an abomination," Billy said, her voice echoing with the finality of a closing coffin. "He is not alive. He is not dead. He is a glitch." Dean looked at her. "Can you reap him?" Billy tightened her grip on the rusting scythe. "I can try, but if I miss, if he breaks this," she looked at the weapon, "then there is no more dying, ever, for anyone." It was the ultimate gamble. The Winchesters knew the stakes. If Death broke, the universe would become a crowded, screaming purgatory. "Hey, look who it is!" Deadpool shouted, letting go of the bull and flying through the air, landing in a superhero crouch. The Moody Blues and the Angel of Thursday. And, "Ooh, scary lady with a stick. Is that a farm implement, or are you just happy to see me?" He walked toward them, stepping over the moaning body of a man whose head was twisted 180 degrees. "I gotta say, this Immortality for Everyone patch I uploaded. Huge success. Look at the engagement numbers. Nobody is logging off." Billy didn't speak. She moved. She was faster than thought. She swung the scythe, a stroke meant to sever the soul from the narrative. The blade connected with Deadpool's neck. It sliced through flesh, bone, and spinal cord. Deadpool's head flew off, spinning in the air. The body dropped. For a second, there was hope. Silence returned. The mechanical bull slowed down. But then, the head, lying on the floor 10 feet away, opened its eyes. "Okay," the head said, "a little off the top. I respect the hustle." The body stood up. It didn't stagger. It walked over to the head, picked it up, and placed it back on the neck. The flesh knitted instantly. The scythe, still in Billy's hand, shattered. It didn't break. It disintegrated into dust. Billy gasped, a sound of genuine pain, as if her own bones had snapped. She fell to her knees, blood, black, ink-like blood, pouring from her nose. The concept of death had attacked the concept of the fourth wall, and the fourth wall had won. The feedback loop broke Billy. She flickered, her form becoming transparent, then solid, then transparent again. She looked at Dean, her eyes wide with terror. I am unwritten, she whispered, and then she vanished, not teleported, erased. The mall shook. The ground beneath them rumbled. The catastrophe was total. Death was gone. The entity was gone. The mechanism was gone. The Winchesters stood alone with the monster who had just killed the inevitable. Deadpool rolled his neck, cracking it. "Wow," he said, looking at the pile of dust that used to be the scythe. "She really fell to pieces, huh? Tough crowd." He looked at Dean. "So, what's next? Musical episode?" "I vote musical episode." Dean looked at Sam. Sam looked at Castiel. The angel was weeping, silent tears of silver grace. The universe was now a closed room with no exit. No one could leave. No one could end. Every injury, every torture, every second of pain would last forever. The human cost had just become infinite. The civilians in the mall, the undying, began to scream louder as they felt the shift. They knew instinctively that the door out of the burning building had just been bricked over. Deadpool clapped his hands. "All right, intermission time. Go get some popcorn, folks, because now we introduce the gratuitous violence." He skipped away, heading toward the sporting goods store, whistling a jaunty tune. Dean raised his shotgun, aimed at the retreating redback, and pulled the trigger. The blast hit Deadpool. He didn't stop. He didn't turn. He just kept skipping. Dean dropped the gun. It was useless. Violence was his language, but Deadpool spoke a dialect they couldn't translate. They were trapped in a story that hated them, with a writer who thought their suffering was a joke. And the worst part, the audience was laughing. Across the world, the consequences cascaded. In hospitals, the terminally ill lingered in agony. In war zones, soldiers blown apart by artillery lay on the mud, conscious, staring at the sky. In the cage, Michael and Lucifer stopped fighting, realizing that their war for the apocalypse was moot because the end could never come. The world had entered a state of permanent, agonizing stagnation. The sun hung low in the sky, refusing to set, casting long, distorted shadows that looked like bars. The supernatural universe had become a prison, and the warden was wearing a red mask. Sam looked at the dust of the scythe. He knelt and touched it. It was cold. "We need help," Sam said, his voice hollow. "We can't fix this. We need someone who understands rules, someone who can legislate reality." Dean looked at him. "Who? God is gone. Death is dead. The angels are glitching." Sam looked up, his eyes hard. "Not God. The competition." He stood up. "We need to go to hell. If death is broken, maybe the empty is leaking. Maybe we can wake up the shadow. If Deadpool is noise, we need to bring him the silence." It was a suicide mission, but suicide was no longer an option. It was a fate worse than death. It was the only play left on the board. They walked out of the mall, stepping over the bodies of the living dead, into a world that had lost the mercy of the end. The Impala waited. A black hearse in a world that had no use for hearses anymore. They got in. The engine started, but the radio didn't play Kansas. It played a dial-up modem sound, screeching and grinding, the sound of a reality trying to connect to a server that didn't exist. The camera, if there was one, pulled back from the Earth, revealing the planet not as a blue marble, but as a comic book page being crumpled by a giant, invisible hand. The edges were fraying, the ink was smearing, and in the margins, doodled in red crayon, was a smiley face with X's for eyes. The caption box at the bottom of the world read, "Oops." The descent into hell was usually a metaphysical journey, a transition of the soul through the veil of death. But with the mechanism of death shattered, the Winchesters had to walk in through the back door. The physical entrance to hell in the supernatural universe was located in a crypt in New Jersey, a damp and forgotten place that smelled of mold and neglect. Now it smelled of pixels. As the Impala crunched over the gravel outside the cemetery, the world around them was screaming. It was a low, constant drone, a frequency composed of billions of voices begging for an end that had been contractually voided. Sam looked out the window at a group of pedestrians who had been struck by a bus. They were mangled, their bodies twisted into shapes that defied anatomy, but they were still moving, dragging themselves across the asphalt, their eyes wide with a panic that had nowhere to go. There was no light at the end of the tunnel, because the tunnel had been bricked up. Dean parked the car, his face a mask of grim determination that was slowly cracking under the weight of the absurdity. He checked his weapons, though he knew they were useless. They were carrying them for comfort, totems of a time when physics made sense. Castiel walked ahead, his trench coat flapping in a wind that didn't move the trees. The angel was vibrating with a sickening resonance. The frequency of heaven was screeching, a feedback loop of panic as the host realized their purpose, to guard the souls of the righteous, was obsolete. There were no souls to guard. Everyone was stuck in the lobby. They descended into the crypt. The portal to hell was a swirling vortex of energy, usually a fiery red. Today, it was a strobe light of magenta and cyan. The color separation was off. As they stepped through, the sensation was not of heat, but of static electricity, 1,000 tiny shocks biting at their skin. They emerged not into the sprawling, labyrinthine corridors of Crowley's former kingdom, but into a glitched render of a dungeon. Walls flickered in and out of existence. The screams of the damned were looping, skipping like a scratch CD. In the center of the main thoroughfare, Rowena MacLeod, the Queen of Hell, stood atop a pile of crates that were textured with the word asset in bright white letters. She was casting, her hands weaving complex patterns of violet magic, trying to hold the architecture of hell together. Her magic was straining, the violet light sputtering as it hit the intrusive reality of the red invader. She saw the Winchesters and dropped her hands, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. She didn't offer a quip. She didn't call them boys. She simply pointed to the ceiling, which was currently displaying a scrolling ticker of nonsensical stock prices for chimichanga futures. Rowena explained the situation with the cold precision of a monarch watching her kingdom dissolve. The queue was gone. The intake processing was overwhelmed. But the worst part was the geography. Deadpool hadn't just broken death. He was actively colonizing hell. He had decided that hell was too gloomy and was in the process of renovating it into a theme park. The lower circles, once reserved for the worst of humanity, were now being converted into a water park called Pool's Inferno. The demons weren't torturing souls. They were being forced to wear mascot costumes and perform musical numbers. The psychological horror of this was far worse than the racks or the knives. To be a demon, a creature of pride and malice, and to be reduced to a background dancer in a slapstick comedy was a humiliation that was breaking the demonic spirit. Rowena revealed that she had lost contact with the outer circles. They had been cropped, simply cut out of the frame. The souls there were gone, not destroyed, just inaccessible, trapped in a narrative void. Dean asked if she could open a door to the empty. Rowena paled. The empty was the one place even she feared to tread. It was the sleeping giant, the void that existed before God and Amara. But she agreed. The logic was sound. If the universe was drowning in noise, they needed the ultimate silencer. While the Winchesters and the Witch Queen plotted a metaphysical suicide mission, Deadpool was busy in Washington, D.C. He had taken up residence in the Lincoln Memorial. He hadn't destroyed the statue. He had simply chiseled a mask onto Lincoln's face and replaced the Gettysburg Address with a review of a taco truck he liked in 2014. He sat in the lap of the stone giant, legs swinging, watching the chaos unfold on a wall of stolen flat-screen TVs. He was bored. The problem with being a god of chaos in a serious universe was that the universe didn't know how to play back. The heroes here were too dour. They cried too much. They didn't banter. He wanted a crossover, but he was getting a drama. He decided to up the stakes. He reached into his pouch and pulled out a plot device. It was a literal device, a black box with a big red button labeled plot twist. He pressed it. Across the globe, the sky ripped open. Not a portal, but a tear. Giant, invisible hands reached down, the hands of the artist. But these weren't the hands of Chuck. They were the hands of an erratic, caffeine-addicted penciler. The landscape began to shift. Mountains were erased and redrawn as giant chimichangas. Rivers turned into streams of soda. The laws of gravity were suspended for comedic effect. If you looked down, you fell. If you didn't look down, you could walk on air. The population, terrified and immortal, was forced to participate in the gag. A banker in London stepped off a ledge, expecting to fall, but instead hung in the air until he looked at the camera that wasn't there, held up a sign that said, "Yikes," and then plummeted. It was forced participation in a slapstick nightmare. The human cost was no longer just pain. It was the loss of dignity, the loss of the self. They were becoming props. In hell, the ground shook as the plot twist wave hit the metaphysical plane. The walls of the dungeon turned into cardboard cutouts. Rowena screamed as her dress turned into a clown suit. The magic of the witch was being overwritten by the magic of the gag. Dean looked at his hands. They were turning into oversized cartoon gloves. "We have to do this now," Sam shouted, his voice sounding pitch-shifted and squeaky. Rowena gritted her teeth, fighting the transformation, channeling every ounce of her ancient power to keep the circle stable. She began the incantation to open the door to the empty. It wasn't a spell of summoning. It was a spell of intrusion. They were going to knock on the door of the shadow and wake it up. Castiel stepped into the circle. He was the key. As an angel, he had a connection to the empty. He would be the bait. The ritual was agonizing. The energy required to pierce the veil of the empty was immense, and with the ambient magic of the world glitching, Rowena had to use her own life force as a battery. Her skin grayed, her hair withered, but she held the line. The circle flared with a light that was not light. It was the absence of light. A black hole opened in the floor of hell. It didn't suck air in, it pushed silence out. A silence so profound it hurt the ears. The cartoonish noises of Deadpool's reality, the slide whistles, the laugh tracks, were instantly dampened. The silence spread, a radius of absolute zero narrative. In that circle, Dean's hands returned to normal. Rowena's dress returned to velvet. The reality asserted itself through the power of the void. Castiel knelt by the hole. "Hello," he shouted into the abyss. "We need to talk." There was no answer, just the cold pressure of 1 billion years of nothing. Sam grabbed Castiel's shoulder. "CAs, you have to provoke it. It wants to sleep. Make noise." Castiel nodded. He began to pray, not to God, but to the shadow. He projected his memories, the wars, the betrayals, the endless noise of the Winchester lives, directly into the hole. He broadcasted the entire chaotic history of their time on Earth. It was an assault of information. Deep in the empty, the shadow stirred. It was a viscous, ancient intelligence that hated existence. It hated stories. It hated consciousness. And right now, it was suffering a migraine. The intruder, Deadpool, was a constant scratching sound in its mind, a neon sign flashing in a dark room. But this new irritation, this angel screaming memories into its ear, was the final straw. The shadow rose. It didn't climb out of the hole. The hole expanded to become the room. The dungeon of hell vanished, replaced by a boundless black ocean of viscous goo. The Winchesters, Rowena, and Castiel stood on a floating island of obsidian. The shadow formed a humanoid shape, mimicking Castiel's face, but with eyes that were black voids and a smile that was all teeth. "You are loud," the shadow said. Its voice was not a sound. It was a vibration in the bone. "The universe is loud. Who broke the quiet?" Dean stepped forward. He didn't flinch. "A tourist. Guy in a red suit. He killed death. He's rewriting the script. We need you to shut him up." The shadow tilted its head. It looked at Dean, then at the world beyond the veil. It saw the pool's inferno. It saw the giant Chimichanga mountains. It saw the speech bubbles clogging the atmosphere. The shadow recoiled. To a being of pure nothingness, Deadpool was an abomination of infinite content. He was pure information, generating data at a rate that threatened to fill the empty itself. If Deadpool died, he would come here. And if he came here, he would never stop talking. The empty would cease to be a place of rest and become a talk show. The shadow realized the existential threat. "I cannot reap him," the shadow said. "He does not have a soul I can touch. He is fictional. He is an idea that thinks it is alive." "So unwrite him," Sam said. "You're the empty. You're the waste bin. Delete the file." The shadow turned its void eyes on Sam. "To delete him, I must delete the context that holds him. He has anchored himself to your reality. He has written himself into the margins of your history. If I remove him, I remove everything he has touched." "He's touched everything," Rowena whispered. "He's retconned the entire timeline." "Exactly," the shadow said. "To save the silence, I must wipe the board. I will not just kill him. I will consume this reality. I will return it to the state before the light. No noise, no pain, just sleep." The negotiation had failed. They had gone to the police to report a noise complaint, and the police had decided to burn down the neighborhood. The shadow began to expand. The black goo rose like a tidal wave, threatening to swallow the obsidian island. It wasn't just targeting Deadpool. It was targeting the concept of the supernatural universe. It was going to enact a server wipe. "Wait," Castiel shouted. "If you wipe the board, you lose the deal. You want to sleep. If you destroy us, the noise stops. But the creator, Chuck, he will just write it again. He loves this story. He will bring it back, louder, messier. You know him. He never lets anything stay dead." The shadow paused. The wave hovered, suspended. It knew the creator. It knew the tenacity of the Winchester story. It was the cockroach of narratives. It would reboot. "What do you suggest, little angel?" the shadow hissed. "Don't wipe the board," Castiel said, his mind racing, channeling the tactical brilliance of a soldier who who had fought in heaven's wars for millennia. Isolate the glitch, trap him in a paradox, make him want to leave. He's a character. He needs an audience. If you cut the feed, if you create a zone of absolute non-observation, he ceases to exist. The shadow considered this a zone of anti-narrative, a place where nothing happens and no one watches, a fourth wall that is opaque. I can create such a cage, the shadow said, but I need a lock. I need a consciousness to hold the door shut, a soul that is willing to be the eternal observer of nothing, a warden for the bore. Dean stepped forward. I'll do it. No. Sam grabbed his arm. Dean, no. I'm the guy who goes to hell, Sam. It's my move. It requires a celestial mind, the shadow interrupted. A human mind would crack in a nanosecond. It must be an angel, or a witch of supreme power. Rowena took a step back. I'm fond of the quiet, darling, but I have plans. Castiel looked at Dean. He looked at the man he had rebelled for, fallen for, died for. I will do it, Castiel said. I've spent eons in silence watching humanity. I can watch the void. CAs, don't you dare, Dean growled. We find another way. There is no other way, Dean, Castiel said. His voice calm, the soldier's resignation setting in. The world is screaming. Look at it. He gestured to the rift. Through the tear in reality, they could see the escalation. Deadpool had grown to the size of a kaiju. He was stomping through New York City, which was now made of Legos. He was fighting a giant manifestation of his own ego. The fan club was rioting, burning down libraries because reading was too slow. The fabric of the universe was dissolving into white space. The ink was running out. Fine, the shadow said. The deal is struck. The angel for the silence. The shadow lunged. It didn't take Castiel. It took the concept of the plan. It flowed into Castiel, turning his eyes pitch black. But it didn't consume him. It empowered him. Castiel became the avatar of the empty, a weaponized void. He turned to the Winchesters. Go, he said, his voice layering over the shadow's drone. Get to the surface. Distract him. Get him to look at me. I need eye contact. I need him to see the nothing. Rowena teleported them. The sensation was instant and nauseating. They appeared on a rooftop in New York City. The air smelled of burnt plastic and chimichangas. Giant Deadpool was wrestling a skyscraper that had grown arms. He was laughing. A boom that shattered windows. Is this meta enough for you? He roared at the sky. Dean racked his shotgun, though he knew it was symbolic. Hey, he screamed into the chaotic wind. Hey, ass butt. It was a callback. A desperate, tiny callback in the face of a god. But Deadpool heard it. He stopped wrestling the building. He turned his massive, masked head toward the rooftop. He zoomed in, his eyes narrowing. Dino, Sammy, did you bring the pie? Please tell me you brought pie. We brought the cancellation, Dean muttered. From the street below, darkness erupted. It wasn't smoke. It was the absence of light. A pillar of pure negative space shot up into the sky, piercing the clouds, piercing the narrative. In the center of the pillar floated Castiel. Wings of black ink unfurled, spanning the horizon. He wasn't glowing with grace. He was radiating silence. The noise of the city died. The music stopped. The colors desaturated. Deadpool looked at Castiel. For the first time, he didn't have a quip. The yellow caption boxes that usually surrounded him flickered and vanished. He saw what Castiel had become. He saw the end of the show. Hey now, Deadpool said, his voice shrinking, losing its reverb. Let's not be hasty. Ratings are up. Merch sales are through the roof. Castiel didn't speak. He opened his mouth, and the empty screamed. It was a scream that tore the fourth wall down, not to let the audience in, but to push the audience out. The sky turned white, not bright white, but paper white. The blank page. Deadpool grabbed his head. No, don't turn the page. I'm not done. I have a monologue. The conflict had shifted from physical to editorial. Castiel was imposing a mandate of the end onto a character who was defined by to be continued. The friction between these two absolutes caused the reality to fracture. Cracks appeared in the air, actual, jagged black lines. The undying on the streets below looked up, their pain momentarily forgotten as they saw the sky crack like a windshield. Sam watched the readings on his EMF meter. "It's not working," he yelled over the roaring silence. "He's too heavy. He's anchored by the belief of the audience. As long as someone, somewhere, is entertained, he can't be deleted." Dean looked at the camera. He looked directly at the lens that wasn't there. He realized the game. If Deadpool was powered by the audience, they had to make the audience look away. They had to make it boring. They had to make it hurt. "Sam," Dean said, dropping his gun. "Stop fighting." "What?" "Stop fighting. Stop running. Just sit down." Dean sat on the edge of the roof. He let his legs dangle. He looked tired. He looked old. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a man who was done. Sam understood. He sat down next to him. Rowena, understanding the theatricality of anticlimax, sat on a gargoyle, filing her nails. They denied Deadpool the conflict. They denied him the reaction. Deadpool looked down. "What are you doing?" "Fight me. Crossover event. Big battle. CGI budget explosion." "No," Dean said softly. "We're good." Deadpool froze. He vibrated with nervous energy. "You can't just sit there. That's bad television. Do something." "Why?" Sam asked. "So you can make a joke about it?" "We're done." The lack of narrative momentum hit Deadpool harder than any punch. He began to shrink. The kaiju form wavered. Without conflict, his presence had no anchor. The shadow Castiel seized the moment. The black wings wrapped around the shrinking red figure. The void began to digest the noise. But just as the darkness was about to close, a hand burst through the black ichor, a gloved hand holding a pencil. Deadpool wasn't giving up. He was rewriting the rewrite. He was drawing a door in the wall of the empty. "You can't cancel me," Deadpool screamed, his voice bubbling through the goo. "I'm public domain in my heart." The struggle was deadlocked. The force of nothing against the force of everything. The vibration threatened to shatter the planet. The tectonic plates groaned. California began to slide into the ocean, not from an earthquake, but because the map was being folded. Suddenly, a third variable entered the equation. A beat-up 1967 Chevy Impala fell out of the sky, landing on the rooftop with a suspension-destroying crash. But there was nobody driving. The trunk popped open. Inside was not weapons. Inside was a manuscript. The pages were glowing. It was the Word of God. The tablets, but they were changing. The text was rearranging itself. The universe, sensing its own destruction, was trying to generate an antibody. The text wasn't Enochian. It was a cease and desist order. Deadpool saw the manuscript. He gasped. "Lawyers," he whispered in horror. "The one thing worse than writers. The world held together by duct tape and hope." The shadow had Deadpool in a chokehold. The Winchesters were on a rooftop staging a sit-in against the genre, and the legal department of the cosmos had just arrived. The ideological fracture was complete. It was no longer good versus evil. It was copyright versus chaos. And in the distance, the white nothingness of the blank page was creeping closer. erasing the horizon mile by mile. The story was eating itself. The glowing manuscript in the trunk of the Impala did not emit heat, but it radiated a pressure that made the air in the lungs feel like concrete. The pages shuffled themselves with the sound of dry leaves skittering on pavement. A frantic reorganization of destiny that was attempting to patch the hole in the world. Dean Winchester stood on the edge of the roof, his boots crunching on the gravel, staring at the book as if it were a bomb. Beside him, Sam was on his knees, clutching his head as the headache that had started in the bunker blossomed into a blinding migraine. Sam could hear the scratching. It was the sound of a billion quills moving in unison. A cosmic stenography pool working overtime to correct the record. The silence that Castiel, now the avatar of the empty, had imposed on the city was breaking, but not because of noise. It was breaking because of the law. The manuscript was not just a book. It was the source code of the supernatural reality, the tablet of the writer, and it had detected a fatal error. The error was not just Deadpool. The error was the deviation. The universe had tolerated the Winchesters' defiance for decades because Chuck found it entertaining. But Chuck was gone, and the automated systems left behind were not interested in entertainment. They were interested in consistency. From the open trunk, a light projected upward, coalescing into forms. They were not angels. They were not demons. They were the auditors. They appeared as tall, slender figures made of shifting grey static, wearing suits that lacked texture. Their faces smooth, blank ovals with no eyes, noses, or mouths. There were 3 of them. They did not walk. They glided, their feet passing through the rooftop debris without disturbing it. The first auditor raised a hand, and the giant kaiju-sized Deadpool, who was still struggling against the grip of the shadow Castiel, froze. The red colossus didn't just stop moving. He stopped rendering. His textures popped out. The vibrant red of his suit turned to a flat, wireframe mesh. The auditor made a slashing motion, a gesture of editing, and the giant Deadpool shrieked, a sound that was cut short as his mouth was erased. A black bar appeared over where his lips should be. The concept of silence that Castiel had weaponized was emotional and void-based. The silence the auditors imposed was administrative. It was the silence of a redacted file. Deadpool, the man, the original anomaly on the roof, scrambled backward, his boots slipping on the gravel. For the first time since his arrival, the mercenary looked genuinely terrified. He knew what these things were. He had fought supervillains, gods, and aliens. But every character in fiction fears the retcon. The auditors were the embodiment of the editorial mandate that says, "This never happened." The second auditor turned its blank face toward Castiel. The angel, still wrapped in the cloak of the empty's darkness, hissed, a sound like tearing metal. He lashed out with a tendril of black goo, intending to consume the bureaucrat of reality. The tendril struck the auditor and simply vanished. It didn't splash. It was deleted. The auditor raised a hand, and Castiel fell from the air, the black wings of the empty shredding into paper confetti. The angel hit the roof hard, the darkness receding, leaving him gasping, human and vulnerable. The connection to the shadow severed by a force that denied the existence of the void in this specific genre. The shadow, terrified of being formatted, fled back into the earth, abandoning its vessel. Sam tried to stand, but the third auditor pointed a finger at him. Sam froze. He wasn't paralyzed by magic. He was paralyzed by continuity. The auditor spoke, not with a voice, but with a direct injection of information into their brains. The voice was genderless, toneless, and terrifyingly polite. It stated that Samuel Winchester was a recurring anomaly. It cited the times he had died and returned, the times he had been possessed, the times he had broken the natural order. It declared that his character arc was mathematically unsound. The auditor began to close his hand. Sam gasped as he felt his history being stripped away. He forgot the layout of the bunker. He forgot the taste of demon blood. He forgot Jessica. His eyes went wide as his identity was peeled back layer by layer, the universe trying to revert him to a factory setting. Dean saw his brother's eyes vacating, the intelligence and trauma draining out of them, replaced by a smooth, unwritten innocence that was horrifying to behold. Dean moved. He didn't think. He reacted. He grabbed the sawed-off shotgun, though he knew it was useless, and stepped between Sam and the auditor. "Hey," Dean shouted. "You want to edit someone? Edit me." The auditor paused. It tilted its head. It assessed Dean Winchester. It found him to be the central knot of the tangled timeline. It acknowledged that removing Dean would unravel the entire structural integrity of the reality. It hesitated. In that second of hesitation, Deadpool crawled over to Dean. The mercenary was missing an arm. It had been erased by the first auditor, but he was still moving. He grabbed Dean's ankle. "They don't care about you, Dino," Deadpool whispered, his voice hoarse, devoid of the usual manic energy. "They're not villains. They're the clean-up crew. They're going to reboot it. All of it. Back to the pilot. No CAs, no Jack, no Mom. Just you and Sam hunting Wendigos until the ratings drop." Dean looked down at the masked man. The blood pooling under Deadpool was real. The fear was real. The absurdity had been stripped away, leaving a desperate survivor who knew the system was rigged. "How do we stop them?" Dean demanded. Deadpool reached into his remaining pouch with his remaining hand. He pulled out a small, unassuming object. It was a white-out pen, but it hummed with a frequency that made Dean's teeth ache. "This is a piece of the source," Deadpool said. "I stole it from the margins. It can't delete them, but it can rewrite the context. If you use it, you break the genre lock." Dean looked at the auditors. They were advancing. Sam was on his knees, drooling, muttering about law school, his memories of hunting almost gone. Castiel was unconscious. The world was dissolving into white space at the edges of his vision. The choice was binary. Let the auditors fix the world, which meant losing Sam, losing CAs, losing everything they had fought for, and returning to a pure timeline where they were just soldiers following orders. Or take the pen, trust the lunatic, and break the world in a way that couldn't be fixed, but might let them survive. It was a small choice, a piece of plastic in a gloved hand. Dean looked at Sam's blank face. He looked at the grey, faceless monster stealing his brother's soul. The anger that had fueled Dean Winchester for 40 years, the defiance against God, against destiny, against the script, flared white-hot. He dropped the shotgun. He snatched the white-out pen from Deadpool. The auditor lunged, moving with a glitchy speed, its hand reaching for Dean's forehead to wipe him. Dean didn't attack the auditor. He attacked the air. He attacked the space between them. He uncapped the pen and slashed a line through the empty air, screaming a word that Deadpool had whispered to him. A word that didn't belong in the supernatural universe. A word that belonged in the chaotic, crossover-heavy multiverse of comics. Dean screamed, "Cannon!" He slashed the pen through to the word as he spoke it. The white fluid from the pen didn't fall. It hung in the air, glowing with a neon toxicity. It burned a hole in the reality. The no cannon rule was invoked. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The auditor shrieked, a sound like a dial-up modem dying, as their grey forms were contaminated by colour. The first auditor turned plaid. The second sprouted wings made of knives. The third, the one erasing Sam, exploded into a shower of comic books. The rigid structure of the supernatural universe, the canon, that the auditors were trying to enforce, shattered. The walls of the reality didn't just crack, they dissolved. The crossover was no longer an invasion, it was a merger. The rooftop vanished. Dean, Sam, CAs, and Deadpool fell. They didn't fall down, they fell through. They tumbled through a kaleidoscope of art styles. For a moment, Dean was drawn by Jack Kirby, blocky and muscular. Then he was a noir silhouette. Then he was hyper-realistic oil paint. They landed on a surface that felt like asphalt but looked like a splash page. They were back in Lawrence, Kansas, but it was wrong. The sky was filled with text boxes. The buildings were distorted, looming at impossible angles. And the people were hybrids. A mailman walked by, but he had the green skin of a goblin. A dog barked, but the bark appeared as a visible woof that knocked over a trash can. The infection was total. Dean stood up. He looked at his hands. They were normal, but he felt different. He felt enhanced. He felt the narrative weight of a protagonist who could not die because the franchise required him. Sam gasped, his memories rushing back with the force of a physical blow. He vomited on the pavement. "Dean," he choked out, "what did you do?" Dean looked at the white-out pen, which crumbled into dust in his hand. "I changed the channel," Dean said. Deadpool pulled himself up. His arm popped back into existence with a plop sound effect. He looked around the twisted version of Lawrence and laughed, but it was a nervous laugh. "Congratulations, boys," Deadpool said. "You didn't just break the fourth wall. You tore down the building. Welcome to the amalgam." The victory over the auditors had a cost. By destroying the antibodies, Dean had allowed the virus to become systemic. The supernatural universe was now operating on comic book logic. This meant that the stakes had escalated from saving the world to crisis on infinite Earths. The laws of magic were gone, replaced by the power cosmic, and the vacuum left by the auditors attracted attention. Not from the writers, but from the villains. The sky darkened, not with clouds, but with ships. Massive, blocky, technological dreadnoughts that defied aerodynamic principles descended from the text-filled clouds. They were not alien ships. They were darker. They bore the sigil of the British men of letters, but twisted, militarized, powered by technology that shouldn't exist for another 1,000 years. The leader of this new threat projected a hologram into the center of the town square. It was Ketch, but not the Arthur Ketch they knew. This was a Ketch who had survived a different timeline, a Ketch who had been upgraded with cybernetics and dark magic. He wore a suit of power armor that looked like a fusion of Iron Man tech and Enochian warding. He spoke, his voice amplified by the city's infrastructure. "Citizens of Sector 616B, Ketch announced. "Order has collapsed. I am assuming direct control. Compliance is mandatory. Resistance will be retconned." This was the outcome of the choice. By rejecting the auditor's reset, Dean had created a power vacuum that allowed the worst authoritarian impulses of his world to merge with the supervillainy of Deadpool's world. The villains were leveling up. Sam looked at the ships. "Dean, we can't fight spaceships with handguns." Dean looked at Deadpool. "You did this. You brought the crazy here." Deadpool shrugged. "I brought the possibility. You're the one who signed the waiver." Deadpool pointed to a crater nearby where a meteorite had just landed. "When things get this bad, the heroes get a power-up. Go check the loot crate. Dean walked to the crater. Inside was not a rock, but a hammer. It wasn't Mjolnir. It was a sledgehammer, rusted, wrapped in barbed wire, but glowing with the blue grace of an archangel. It was a weapon forged from the residue of the collision. Dean picked it up. He felt the power of a storm surge through him. He looked at Sam. "Sammy, check the trunk." Sam ran to the Impala. The trunk was open. The weapons inside had changed. The demon knife was now a lightsaber-esque blade of pure energy. The angel blades were vibrating guns. They were being equipped for a genre war. But the emotional weight remained heavy. This wasn't cool. It was horrifying. They were losing their humanity, becoming action figures in a cosmic sandbox. Castiel woke up. He looked different. His trench coat was now armor. His eyes were no longer blue. They were shifting kaleidoscopes of color. He looked at Dean with a stranger's intensity. "The empty is gone," Castiel said. "There is no more silence. There is only the signal, and I can hear it all." Castiel clutched his head. "They are rewriting the Bible, Dean. They are making Lucifer a hero. They are making God a villain. The moral axis is spinning." This was the true horror. It wasn't just the physical merger. It was the moral inversion. In a comic book universe, morality is flexible, subject to the era and the writer. In the supernatural universe, good and evil were concrete, tangible forces. Now, those lines were blurring. Ketch wasn't just a bad guy. He was a complex antagonist, with a tragic backstory that was currently being broadcast to the population to garner sympathy. The civilians, confused and terrified, were starting to cheer for the ships. They were being brainwashed by the narrative tropes. They wanted safety, and the man in the iron suit promised order. The Winchesters were now the rebels, the chaotic element. "We need a base," Dean said, hefting the stormhammer. "The bunker is compromised." "I know a place," Deadpool said. "But you're not going to like it." "Where?" "The cage," Deadpool grinned. "It's the only place with a strong enough firewall to keep the narrative out. Plus, I hear the rent is cheap." The decision to retreat to Lucifer's cage was the final strategic shift. To save the world, they had to go to the heart of their greatest trauma. They had to ally with the memory of their torture. As they climbed into the Impala, which now hovered, its wheels folding under the chassis like a DeLorean, Dean looked back at the town of Lawrence. It was being paved over by Ketch's robots, turned into a gleaming, soulless metropolis of steel and neon. The heartland was gone. The Americana was dead. In its place was a panel 1 of a dystopian crossover event. They sped toward the rift that would lead them to the cage. But as they flew, Sam looked to the dashboard. The radio was playing. It was a news broadcast. Breaking news. The protagonists have fled. The antagonist has seized control of the narrative. Up next, the execution of Mary Winchester. Sam froze. "Dean," he whispered. "Mom." Dean's knuckles turned white on the steering yoke. "She's dead, Sam. She's been dead." "Not here," Sam said, pointing at the windshield, which was now displaying a HUD. "In this version, she's the hostage. It's a trope, Dean. The fridge. They brought her back just to kill her to motivate us. The cruelty of the new reality was absolute. It knew their buttons and it was mashing them." Dean spun the car around. "We're not going to the cage," Dean growled. The hammer on the seat beside him sparked with lightning. "We're going to get Mum." Deadpool sighed, leaning back in the seat. Classic mistake. Falling for the bait. This is exactly what the writers want. You go for the emotional rescue, you walk right into the trap, and bam! Cliffhanger. "Shut up," Dean said. "Or I use this hammer on you. Joke's on you. I'm into that." Deadpool muttered, but he checked his pistols. He looked worried. The narrative was moving too fast. It was rushing toward a conclusion that felt unearned. It felt like a cancellation. The universe wasn't just changing. It was accelerating toward a finale. And in a crossover like this, the finale usually meant a reset button that erased everyone involved. Deadpool realized that he might not survive this one. He looked at his hand. It was fading, not erased, but transparent. He was losing billing. The Winchesters were becoming the superheroes, and he was becoming the comic relief sidekick who dies to raise the stakes. "Dean," Deadpool said, his voice serious, "if we go back there, I can't guarantee I can protect you. The logic there, it's grim dark. It's the 90s all over again. Pouches and teeth." "I don't need protection," Dean said. He accelerated. The hovering Impala broke the sound barrier, creating a sonic boom that shattered the glass of the text boxes floating in the sky. They were flying into the teeth of the New World Order, driven by a love that the narrative was cynically exploiting. As they approached the city center, the sky turned red. The ships formed a circle. A beam of light shot down, illuminating a platform where a woman knelt, bound in chains of energy. It was Mary, but she looked wrong. She was younger, dressed in a sexualized version of her hunting gear. It was a corruption of her memory. Sam looked away, sickened. Dean stared, his eyes burning with a rage that transcended genre. He didn't care if it was a trap. He didn't care if it was a trope. He was going to kill the author of this scene. The Impala diving toward the city. A black streak against a blood-red sky. On the ground, Arthur Ketch smiled, his cybernetic eye whirring. He raised his hand, and a legion of monster cyborgs raised their weapons. The trap was set. The heroes were committed. And in the background, the white-out pen's mark still hung in the air. A jagged scar on the face of reality that was slowly, inevitably, widening into a mouth. The universe was screaming, and for the first time, Dean Winchester wasn't trying to save it. He was trying to kill it to save his mother. The slide from hero to anti-hero was complete. The final convergence was set not for salvation, but for mutual destruction. The hover Impala screamed as it banked through the canyon of steel and neon, its undercarriage scraping against the sheer glass face of a skyscraper that doubled as a propaganda obelisk. Dean Winchester gripped the yoke, his eyes fixed on the execution platform suspended in the red sky, ignoring the structural groans of the car that was never meant to fly. The air around them was thick with enemy fire, beams of coherent light that didn't just burn metal but erased it, leaving perfectly spherical voids in the chassis. This was the final siege, an assault not on a fortress, but on the climax itself. Sam Winchester sat in the passenger seat, the glowing energy blade humming in his hand, his face pale and slick with sweat. He wasn't just fighting fear, he was fighting the script. The narrative pressure was crushing, a physical weight that tried to force him into a monologue, tried to force him to acknowledge the hopelessness of the situation, to heighten the drama. Sam bit his tongue until he tasted copper, grounding himself in the pain, refusing to let the genre dictate puppet his mouth. In the back, Castiel was a conduit of terrifying noise. The angel had become a receiver for every frequency in the multiverse, his eyes cycling through the color spectrum of a broken television, muttering coordinates and biblical verses that were being rewritten in real time. Deadpool huddled on the floorboard, clutching his fading chest, the yellow boxes around his head flickering like dying fireflies. He was the patient zero of this infection, and as the host body, the supernatural universe, fought back with this grotesque antibody of a grim dark finale, he was being rejected. The universe was trying to cure itself by killing everything that didn't fit the new, darker tone. The Impala breached the perimeter of the Cyborg Legion. These were not the monsters of the week. These were vampires upgraded with tactical aimbots, werewolves with carbon fiber endoskeletons, ghosts tethered to hard drives that prevented exorcism. They were efficient, lethal, and utterly soulless. Dean didn't slow down. He punched the afterburner, a button that had replaced the cassette deck, and the car turned into a missile. They slammed into the phalanx of flying horrors, the sheer kinetic force of the vehicle shattering the formation. The storm hammer on the seat beside Dean arced with blue electricity, sensing the collision. Dean grabbed it. "Bail out," he roared, his voice cracking not from fear, but from the sheer volume of the chaos. The doors blew open. The Winchesters and the Angel dove into the open air, falling toward the platform where the false Mary waited. The Impala continued on its trajectory, a suicide runner crashing into the flagship of Arthur Ketch's fleet. The explosion was silent at first, a flash of white blinding the city before the sound caught up, a deafening bass-heavy thud that felt like the heartbeat of a dying god. Dean landed on the platform, the impact cracking the synthetic marble. He didn't roll. He absorbed the shock with a supernatural durability that felt alien to his bones. He stood up, the hammer heavy in his hand, the blue lightning crawling up his arm, smelling of ozone and grace. He looked across the expanse. Arthur Ketch stood waiting, encased in his techno-magical power armor, a cape of hard light energy flowing behind him. He looked like a king of the wasteland, a villain designed to sell toys. Beside him, Mary Winchester knelt, head bowed, chains of red energy binding her wrists. But as Dean looked at her, his hunter's instinct, the part of him that knew the difference between a shapeshifter and a human, between a demon and a soul, screamed a warning. The woman didn't smell like his mother. She didn't smell like resurrection. She smelled like ink. She smelled like a plot point. Ketch laughed, his voice amplified by the city's grid. He didn't speak to Dean. He spoke to the sky, to the invisible audience that his regime was courting. He declared that the age of chaos was over, that the narrative would be disciplined, structured, and eternal. He announced that the death of the matriarch would cement the new order, providing the tragic motivation necessary to fuel the next 100 seasons of the Empire. It was a speech devoid of ideology, purely focused on the mechanics of control. Dean didn't listen. He began to walk. Each step was a labor. The air around Ketch was dense with narrative armor. The universe didn't want the villain to lose yet. The scene hadn't run its course. Dean pushed against the invisible wall, his muscles straining, the veins in his neck bulging. He was fighting the pacing of the story. Sam and Castiel landed on the flanks, immediately engaged by the elite guard. Sam fought with the grace of a Jedi, his light blade deflecting plasma bolts, severing limbs with surgical precision. But he hated it. Every kill felt weightless. There was no grit, no struggle. It was too clean. He longed for the jagged edge of a machete, for the desperate scramble in the mud. This power fantasy was a prison. Castiel unleashed the signal. He opened his mouth and broadcasted the noise of the empty, a sonic weapon that disrupted the cyborg's programming. The monsters seized, their code corrupted by the existential dread of the void. But there were too many of them. The sky kept pouring reinforcements, dropships deploying fresh waves of content to keep the heroes busy. Deadpool crashed onto the platform behind Dean, missing a leg which was slowly regrowing with a sickening squelch. He crawled forward, coughing up blood that turned into pixels before it hit the ground. He grabbed Dean's boot. He warned Dean that it was a trap, not a physical one. but a literary one. He explained that if Dean saved her, the story would validate the reboot. If Dean failed, the story would validate the tragedy. Both paths led to Ketch winning. The only way to win was to reject the premise. Dean looked down at the mercenary. The red mask was torn, revealing the scarred, cancerous tissue beneath. Deadpool looked tired. He looked like a man who had told the same joke for 40 years and suddenly realized no one was laughing. He told Dean to look at her eyes. Dean looked. Mary raised her head. Her eyes were blank, not empty like a corpse, but empty like an unfinished drawing. There were no pupils, just white space. Dean reached the center of the platform. Ketch ignited a blade of pure darkness, a weapon forged from the shadows of the narrative. He swung. Dean met the strike with the hammer. The collision didn't make a clang. It made a boom that shattered the windows of the surrounding skyscrapers. The shockwave knocked Mary over. She didn't react. She didn't scream. She just lay there, a doll waiting for her cue. Dean swung again, a brutal haymaker swing that ignored finesse. He wasn't fencing. He was demolishing. The hammer smashed into Ketch's armor, denting the pristine metal. Ketch staggered, his perfect villain persona cracking. He shouted that this wasn't in the script, that the hero was supposed to be weakened by grief. Dean hit him again and again. With each blow, Dean shouted a denial. He denied the arc. He denied the reboot. He denied the crossover. But Ketch was strong. He caught the hammer with a gauntleted hand, the servos in his armor whining. He backhanded Dean, sending him skidding across the platform. Dean spat blood, real blood. The injury grounded him. It reminded him that he was still human beneath the power-up. Ketch walked toward Mary. He raised his dark blade. He was going to execute the trope. He was going to fridge the mother to break the sun. Dean tried to rise, but his body was heavy, held down by the gravity of the inevitable cutscene. Then, Sam was there. Sam didn't attack Ketch. He attacked the chains. He slashed the light blade through the red energy binding the construct. The chains shattered, but Mary didn't run. She stood up, her movements jerky, unnatural. She looked at Dean, then at Ketch. She opened her mouth, and a sound came out that wasn't a voice. It was the sound of a printer jamming, a screech of mechanical failure. The construct was glitching. The presence of two conflicting genre protagonists, the gritty hunter and the comic book villain, was tearing the NPC apart. Ketch looked confused. He commanded her to scream, to cry, to play her part. She didn't. She began to unravel. Her skin peeled away like paper, revealing a wireframe underneath. Deadpool laughed. It was a wet, broken sound. He pulled a pin on a grenade, but he didn't throw it. He held it. He crawled toward the center of the breakdown. He told them that the source code was exposed. The glitch in the Mary construct was a backdoor. If they hit it hard enough, they could crash the server. Ketch realized the danger. He turned to kill Deadpool, but Castiel intercepted. The angel tackled the warlord, driving him into the ground. Castiel's armor burned with white fire as he grappled with the dark technology. "Dean," Castiel shouted, "end it. Destroy the lie." Dean looked at the unraveling shape of his mother. It was the hardest thing he had ever had to do. Even knowing it wasn't her, the image was seared into his soul. It was Mary. It was Mum. But it was a mum who existed only to die. A mum created to be a victim. Dean realized that letting this thing exist was the ultimate insult to her memory. He gripped the hammer. He didn't look at Ketch. He looked at the white, pupilless eyes of the construct. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "but you're not real." Dean threw the hammer. It didn't fly straight. It curved, guided by the desperate will of a son trying to reclaim his own story. It struck the merry construct in the chest. There was no blood. There was a burst of white light, blinding and absolute. The construct shattered into millions of shards of light. The tragic death was aborted. The narrative fulcrum that Ketch had built his empire on was destroyed. The reaction was catastrophic. The red sky fractured. The text boxes vanished. The ships hanging in the air lost their cohesion and began to dissolve into rain. Ink rain, black and thick, pouring down on the city. Ketch screamed as his armor began to rust instantly. The plot armor stripped away by the destruction of his central plot device. Castiel rolled away as the villain fell to his knees, now just a man in a broken suit, terrified and small. Sam stood over him, the light blade flickering and dying, turning back into the rusty demon knife. The genre shift was reverting. The power fantasy was ending, but the whiteout scar, the tear in reality that Dean had created, was widening. It was reacting to the crash. It was pulling everything in. The buildings, the streets, the sky, everything was being dragged toward the white void. Deadpool lay on his back, watching the end of the world. The grenade in his hand was a dud. Of course it was. He looked at the Winchesters. They were back to their flannel and denim, bruised, bleeding, human. They looked beautiful. They looked real. Deadpool realized that he was the anchor for the collapse. As long as he remained, the supernatural universe would try to reconcile his logic with its own, and the result would be this white-out oblivion. He had to go, but he couldn't just leave. The door was closed. He had to be exiled. "Hey!" Deadpool shouted, sitting up. The yellow boxes were gone. He was speaking with his own voice now, raspy and pain-filled. "Winchesters, you missed a spot." He pointed to himself. "I'm the typo. I'm the continuity error. You gotta erase me." Dean looked at him. The white void was consuming the edge of the platform. The city below was gone, just a white abyss. "We're not killing you, Wade," Dean said. It was the first time he had used the name. "We don't kill the guests." "I'm not a guest. I'm a virus," Deadpool yelled. He stood up on his one good leg. "You want your world back. You want the angst. You want the classic rock. You gotta flush the system. Do it. Use the holy hand grenade. Use the Colt. Use a sternly worded letter. Just get me out of here." Sam looked at the whiteout scar. He understood the physics. The void wanted the anomaly. "Dean," Sam said. "He's right. The void. It's trying to heal the wound. It needs to scab over. He's the infection." Dean looked at the void, then at Deadpool. He hated this. He hated sacrificing anyone. But the world was dissolving. "How?" Dean asked. "Kick me." Deadpool grinned beneath his mask. "Give me the Sparta kick. Make it cinematic. Send me out with a bang." Dean walked over to him. The wind from the void was tearing at their clothes. "You're a pain in the arse," Dean said. "I know," Deadpool said softly. "I'm the merc with the mouth. But hey, thanks for the tacos." Dean didn't hesitate. He didn't make it cinematic. He just shoved him. A hard hunter's shove to the chest. Deadpool stumbled back, lost his balance, and fell off the platform. He didn't scream. He didn't flail. He fell into the white-out scar with a sense of relief. As he hit the white event horizon, he didn't die. He popped like a soap bubble. He vanished from the supernatural continuity. The effect was instant. The white-out scar snapped shut with a sound like a thunderclap. The ink rain stopped. The red sky turned to a bruised, stormy grey. The floating platform lost its anti-gravity and began to fall. The Winchesters and Castiel scrambled, grabbing onto the debris, bracing for impact. But the impact never came. The world shifted, a hard cut. They were on the ground, in a junkyard. The Impala was there, wrecked, smoking, but real. The cyborgs were gone. The futuristic city was gone. Lawrence, Kansas was visible in the distance, damaged, fires burning, but recognizable. It was back. The genre had reset. But it wasn't a clean reset. The damage was done. Dean stood up groaning, his body aching in places he didn't know existed. He looked at Sam. Sam was staring at his hand. He was holding a comic book. It was damp, torn, and bloody. The cover showed a man in a red suit fighting two hunters. Sam opened it. The pages were blank. All of them. The story had been wiped. Castiel sat on the hood of the ruined Impala. He looked exhausted. His wings were gone, burned away in the final exchange. He was mortal again, or something close to it. "Is it over?" Castiel asked. Dean looked around the junkyard. He saw a piece of the cyborg armor half buried in the mud. It hadn't vanished. The physical evidence remained. The trauma remained. "No," Dean said. "It's not over. It just changed back." They heard a sound, a cough. Arthur Ketch lay in a pile of refuse nearby. He wasn't dead. He was broken, bleeding, his tech stripped away, leaving only a man. He looked up at Dean with fear. He expected the execution. He expected the hunter's justice. Dean walked over to him. He looked down at the man who had tried to rewrite their lives. Dean raised his boot, ready to curb stomp the villain, to finish the job. But he stopped. He looked at his boot. He remembered the kick that sent Deadpool into the void. He remembered the absurdity of the violence. He lowered his foot. "Get up," Dean said. Ketch blinked. "What?" "Get up," Dean repeated. "Start walking. If I see you again, I kill you. But today, I'm done with the script." Ketch didn't argue. He scrambled to his feet and ran, limping into the darkness. Dean watched him go. It wasn't mercy. It was exhaustion. It was a refusal to participate in the cycle of retribution that the narrative demanded. Sam walked over to Dean. He threw the blank comic book into a burning barrel. They watched it burn. The smoke rose into the grey sky. "So," Sam said, "what now?" Dean looked at the Impala. It was a wreck. The engine block was cracked. The axles were snapped. It would take months to fix, maybe years. "Now," Dean said, touching the cold metal of the car, "we fix the car, we drive home, and we never, ever mention the guy in the red suit." "Agreed," Sam said. "Agreed," Castiel nodded. They stood in the silence. It was a real silence. No laugh track, no dramatic score. Just the sound of wind in the cornfields and the distant siren of a police car. It was boring. It was mundane. It was perfect. But as they turned to leave, Dean saw something on the ground. A single yellow post-it note stuck to the bumper of the Impala. He peeled it off. There was a doodle of a taco and a message scribbled in crayon. "Missed you already. XOXO." Ian crumbled the note in his hand. He didn't throw it away. He put it in his pocket. A reminder. The walls of reality were thin, and there were things out there that didn't follow the rules. They had survived the crossover, but they had lost the illusion of safety. They were characters in a story that could be rewritten at any moment, and the only thing they could do was keep driving until the ink ran dry. The camera pulled back, not to a cosmic view, but to a street-level view, watching three broken men walking down a lonely highway, leaving the wreckage behind. The screen didn't fade to black. It just cut. Hard. The story continued, unobserved, unwritten, and finally, mercifully, quiet. The disruption was over, but the echo would last forever in the silence of the bunker, in the hesitation before a trigger pull, in the fear of a joke told in the dark. The world was safe. But the Winchesters knew the truth. The fourth wall wasn't a barrier. It was a door, and they had forgotten to lock it. The file was labelled simply Case 616. It sat on the heavy oak table in the centre of the Men of Letters bunker, a thin folder containing only a few pages of erratic, nonsensical data. Sam Winchester sat before it, a glass of whiskey untouched near his hand. He had tried to write the report, to catalogue the entity, the methods, and the solution, but the words refused to hold their shape. Every time he wrote the name of the intruder, the ink seemed to evaporate, leaving the paper pristine and white, as if the universe itself was scrubbing the metadata of the event. The law books in the library were equally silent. The sections on reality warping and multiversal breaches were not torn out, but fused together. The pages melted into solid blocks of parchment by a heat that had no physical source. It was a redaction on a cosmic scale. The physical world had healed, but the psychological geography of the planet was permanently altered. In the weeks following the event, mental health statistics across the Midwest spiked. Thousands of people reported dreams of a red sky, of dying and not dying, of a laughter that sounded like grinding gears. The mass hysteria of Lawrence became a footnote in medical journals, a sociological curiosity explained away by gas leaks and water contamination. But the Winchesters knew the truth. They walked through a world that was effectively a scar tissue, a reality that had been cut open and hastily stitched back together. In the garage, the sounds of a welding torch cut through the silence. Dean was rebuilding the Impala. The car was not just damaged. It had been fundamentally violated, its molecules rearranged by a physics engine that didn't belong in this dimension. As Dean worked, grinding down a piece of metal that had once been part of a futuristic hover conversion, he found things that shouldn't exist. A shell casing etched with a smiley face, a chimichanga wrapper stuffed into the carburetor. He burned them. He didn't keep trophies, but he couldn't burn the feeling that the air in the garage was thinner than before. He found himself checking the corners of the room, not for monsters, but for the invisible lens, the unseen observer. The intrusion had broken the sanctity of their isolation. They now lived with the low-level, gnawing paranoia that their suffering was performative, that their lives were content for a void they couldn't comprehend. Castiel spent his days in the map room, staring at the global readout. The Angel radio was back online, but the chatter was different. The angels were subdued, terrified. They had seen the empty recoil. They had seen the script burn. The hierarchy of heaven was no longer concerned with the apocalypse or the darkness. They were terrified of the cancellation. Castiel understood now that God was not the only author, and that terrified him more than any rebellion. He realized that the greatest threat to their existence wasn't evil, but indifference. If the story stopped being interesting, the whiteout would return. The world continued to turn. The sun rose and set, and monsters still hid in the dark. But the texture of the fight had changed. The Winchesters got back in the car, not because they had won, but because stopping meant looking at the blank page. They drove out of the bunker, hitting the highway under a grey, overcast sky. As the Impala disappeared over the horizon, the camera, the perspective of the history itself, did not follow. It remained fixed on the empty road, on the silence, on the absence of the red and black chaos. The story had returned to its genre, but in the dust of the roadside, a single flower grew. It was a species that didn't exist on Earth, a bright, violent yellow blossom that smelled of gunpowder and tacos, an invasive species taking root in the cracks of the pavement, waiting for the next season.